Let's just talk broadly about this speech. What stood out for you, and what do you think should stood out for the investing public, American citizens at large, the business community? And I think about American citizens who still think about this affordability issue. So what stands out on those fronts?
Yeah, nice to be with you. I mean, this was there was more performance here than policy, we would argue. There was a bit of a spiking of the football in terms of really sort of reinforcing some of what President Trump has perceived as victories, the one big beautiful bill, closing the border, some of the other kind of immigration policies that he has pursued, and also some of the foreign policy wins that he is characterizing at least as wins. So I think that this was in some ways a lot of kind of red meat for his base, as these addresses oftentimes are. Now he did talk about tariffs, as you mentioned. I think that to the relief of many Republicans in that chamber, he did not call on Congress to take a vote on tariffs. I think that is something that probably would have failed anyway, but also would have been politically difficult for Republicans. But by and large, this was, I think, a pretty typical State of the Union address in many ways. It was, again, more of a rehashing of sort of the political wins and pretty light on policy details and light on kind of a roadmap, I think, for a lot of congressional Republicans heading into the midterms.
Yeah, I'm really glad you went to the midterms, because that's exactly where I want to go and try to understand from you if it actually moved the needle on how people could vote come the midterms, because that's what Republicans and Democrats are focused on right now.
I think it was a bit surprising that there were not arguably more policies that he'd actually highlighted in other speeches and other venues, highlighted in last night's speech. He did talk about this ban that he wants Congress to codify in terms of institutional investors investing in single-family homes, but he didn't really talk about some of the other proposals. To Senator Warren's criticism, she remarked that he did not talk about, capping credit cards and what have you. Now, I don't think any of those will actually get effectuated into policy. Those need Congress anyway. But in terms of really leaning into that affordability sort of framework and theme, he didn't really give Republicans all that much. Again, I think what his hope is, and what a lot of Republicans hope is that voters' sentiment around the economy will be different come this fall. Now, of course, that one big beautiful bill, people will be getting refunds on average, $4,000, about $1,000 extra in terms of a refund, relative to last year. So I think the hope is that there will be more optimism and that folks will have a different perception of affordability. And so maybe he won't need to lean into some of those policies. I think that was maybe last night was maybe a tell of that thinking.
Libby, he did focus on the stock market, certainly something we, focus on here at Bloomberg, but, talking about how good that was, right? And wealth created and good for our investors. But is that always a good read, or is that even a good read on kind of the state of the U.S. as a nation and as an economy?
Well, I think there are lots of examples where, voters have, one view of things and the stock market is doing something different. I think if you talk to President Biden, I think that was one of his frustrations and his economics advisor's frustrations, is that actually the market was doing quite well and the economy objectively was doing pretty well, but voters just didn't feel it. So perception is reality here, and going into these midterm elections, again, I think there is a hope that voters will feel better about things. And I think, to President Trump's credit, in terms of the Trump accounts that were codified into one big beautiful bill, this idea of broadening that out and giving folks access to retirement accounts who may not have access to traditional 401k. But so I think he is trying to tie the stock market performance to kind of everyday people's lives. However, we'll see. There's a lot of distance between here and there in terms of getting that actually effectuated into policy.
I think a lot of folks think, what a great idea, right? If we talk about wealth creation, this is a great way to do it. But I do also think about how do we pay for all this stuff, and when do we think about kind of the fiscal house and when that's going to matter. I know go back a decade or so, and it was in every conversation I talked about here at Bloomberg, or even longer than that. Then it went away, and now it's back again. So I just think about when does that all come home to roost, or is it already?
Yes, I think if you contrast this speech with the speech last February, where President Trump was really leaning into this idea of DOGE and cutting federal spending and talking about the deficit, there was no mention of the deficit last night. And in fact, he talked about how important Social Security and Medicare were and how those would not be touched. As you all know, those are important programs. Bipartisan, wide bipartisan support. However, they're both very expensive as well. Our view here is that while there is no kind of immediate fiscal reckoning, I mean, the bond market, as you all know, the bond vigilantes haven't necessarily come out here and disciplined Washington. But it's probably a question of, when, not if, that there will be an inflection point where members of Congress will have to actually do something in terms of sort of the fiscal trajectory. It doesn't look like it's close. There's not a lot of political appetite to increase taxes or reduce spending. But, our view is this sort of 6 to 7% deficits as a percentage of GDP. There will be a limit to that. And whether it's the bond market that is imposing that discipline, or when it's Social Security trust fund starting to kind of go bankrupt, so to speak, which is expected to happen in the early 2030s. So we do think this is a question of when, not if, but it's just the when is probably not under President Trump's term, at least if what the market signals are saying now.
Libby, you've seen different market cycles, different economies under different presidents. We've talked about this a little bit earlier with our own Mike McKee. How do you describe the Trump economy? Is it a good one?
Well, I think that, and again, there is a limitation to how much a president can actually impact the economy. So this is, for better or for worse, presidents, President Trump included, they like to take sort of credit for when things are going well, but also to sort of avoid any of that, blame when they're not. I think we would characterize this economy, this sort of K-shaped two-speed economy is quite real. Where if you just look at the components of GDP, obviously, AI-related capex fueled a lot of growth last year, as did the high-end consumer. I think there is a hope in 2026, and again, this is what I think Republicans are banking on, that the breadth of that economic growth is broader, and that this sort of the consumer at the kind of middle to lower end starts feeling better about things and starts participating in the economy. But if the economy just is predicated on kind of AI-related capex and the high-end consumer, that makes for a relatively fragile economy. And if you sort of see any kind of wobbles in the labor market, for instance, that could have maybe a non-linear impact. So, I think it's a stronger economy. It's been a resilient economy for sure.
Right.
But again, I think Republicans are hoping that you can sort of broaden out the source of that growth, and that they'll actually be rewarded then, come November.
But that AI spend, the impact on the market, sending it higher, and then, the wealth created among affluent spenders, that is something that Greg Dacco has certainly talked about a lot for us from EY Parthenon, and the importance. And if that starts to come undone, that could be problematic, Tim.
Hey, Libby, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk geopolitics, because ahead of the speech, the president, and he's gotten quite a bit of criticism in recent months, even from within his own party, about focusing too much on geopolitics. And while he didn't talk too much about geopolitics, what he did frame last night was, Venezuela and the ouster of Maduro, that being a win for oil companies and Americans who are getting oil and will get oil from Venezuela. And just now we are learning that Cuba has shot 4 dead in a clash with a Florida speedboat. That's just breaking news just in the last few minutes. I'm wondering about geopolitics, though, and the political risk for a president who came in and said, no more on a platform, no more foreign wars, wants to end wars, for focusing so much on geopolitics within his first year in office. Is that alienating some of his base?
I think it's confused some of his base for sure. As you said, that there is a wing of the sort of Trump base that, is more isolationist. I think those folks thought that, President Trump would be sharing in that view. He talked about ending the war in Ukraine. That has not happened. He's talked about, bringing kind of peace globally. I think you could sort of quibble about whether that has actually been true or not. And then to your point, he has focused on, some of these more specific operations. Now, I think, Venezuela, the way that they would characterize, the White House would characterize this is an extradition, kind of a high-profile arrest, if you will, that required a lot of resources of the U.S. government, but was quite different from regime change. We'll see kind of how that plays out. But I do think, Tim, you're right to sort of focus on this politically because midterms are all about turnout. It's not about persuasion, right? You need to get your base turned out. You need them to get excited. Whereas a general election, it's about sort of persuading folks who might be kind of on the fence. Again, midterms all about kind of your base turnout. And if your base is at all, feeling maybe a little bit less enthusiastic about you, they may not turn out. And so I do think this, we'll sort of see how this kind of movie plays out, but you could see President Trump, maybe kind of be forced by his own party to be less focused on these issues because they just doesn't have sort of the galvanizing effect as the kitchen table, gas and grocery issues you typically have. The last thing I'll just say though is I think President Trump was quite clear about what his framework was he was using yesterday as it relates to Iran. He definitely did not close the door on potential intervention. He also didn't necessarily endorse that he was going to do this either. So he was using sort of this clear framework about about Iran's ability to develop a nuclear weapon and what have you as kind of a litmus test. So I think he's trying to be more clear about what it would require to engage. But again, politically, he may be forced to back off this as we get closer to the midterms.
Libby, going back to the affordability issues, we know President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance are hitting the road tomorrow and I believe on Friday to kind of test their affordability message with voters in Texas and Wisconsin this week. So things like, obviously the tax cuts that are already part of his big, beautiful bill, these new savings accounts for kids, maybe banning of institutional investors from buying homes, although we didn't get anything more on that. Are there policies or clarifications of policies or implementation of policies that are likely to come leading up to the midterms that you think kind of improve the affordability issues for those who will be voting?
I think the reality is that even if President Trump wants to see some changes, it's going to be very difficult for Congress to get anything done before the summer, which is really the de facto end of this Congress. That's when they will adjourn for their sort of summer, traditional summer recess for them to really go back to their districts and to campaign. So in terms of the runway to actually effectuate policy, we are talking about a very short one, to July, basically. And we don't see Congress moving. We don't see them passing another tax bill, another spending bill, another bill that prevents institutional investors from buying single-family homes or what have you. There is a housing bill that they may be able to pass both chambers and get signed into law, but that is likely going to be it. So I think kind of for all intents and purposes here, Trump will have to lean on those policies he can effectuate unilaterally, which is the agencies buying, agency MBS. That is one thing that he did not talk about in his speech. It's kind of for us, bond nerds over here. But we do think that's actually, that and deregulation, those are two things that he can and will, we think, continue to lean on to help improve at least mortgage rates and sort of the rate environment in general, and hope that will actually trickle down to some kind of the perception again of affordability among voters. But outside of that, we do not expect Congress to move, really, period, between now and the midterms.
All right.
I don't recall seeing mentions of agency MBSs on the prediction markets.
Wait, that's yesterday. When they all stood up. Remember?
Okay.
They like the...
Exactly. The only bipartisan moment we saw was at our agency MBS.
Bringing the parties together. Libby Cantrill, you rock.